Welcome to the Stoa. My name is David, and I'll be your host today. And what we're doing today is the second session of 4 of Robert Gilman's philosopher in residence for the month of November at the Stoa. And I'm really excited for the second session, and I'll leave to Robert to say more for it. If what we'll do is have something like I'm guessing, something close to 45 minutes to an hour or maybe longer of a presentation that Robert has prepared, followed by a Q&A session. For those of you who are not familiar with how we do Q&As here, you can share your questions into the chat and indicate that it's a question. If you would like to not be recorded while this is recording and will be going on to YouTube, you're welcome to indicate that you would like me to read the question on your behalf, and I will do so. Without further ado, I think I will hand it off to Robert.
Great. Thank you, David. Oh, good to be here after a week. By the way, you may have heard that last week didn't happen because I was in the midst of a power outage that lasted for 30 hours. But all's well at this point. And I probably benefited a little bit from having the extra time. We'll see. In any case, before I start do the screen share, could you join me in a stretch, please? Just welcome your bodies into the space and stretch a bit. Great. All right, let me get the screen share set up here. Okay, good. Can you see that okay? Great. Okay, so this, as David said, this is the second of what will be 3 presentations in the 4 event series about the way forward beyond the dysfunctions of modern culture. And this one is focused on skillful with diverse modes of cognition. The first one was about psychodynamics. The third one will be about adept at the new strategy for success. But this one is focused on skillful with diverse modes of cognition. But before I get into that topic, I want to step back just a little bit and look at what's really motivating me here. In the last presentation, I talked some about the polycrisis, all the various different crises going on in the world, and that certainly provides some level of motivation, but I would say that there's something else that's at least as important to me in terms of my motivation. And I want to ask you to imagine a culture where the people and their institutions embody the harmony within, with others, and with nature. We talk about this as the 3 harmonies. So embody the 3 harmonies within optimal zone living, optimal zone as I talked about in the last presentation, living and resilience, increased joy, effectiveness, and compassion, and decreased fear, greed, and defensiveness. Huge shifts in what we normally think of as, quote, human nature. But that human nature that we normally think of is basically traumatized human nature. Harmony with others. Excuse me. Deeper mutual understanding, easier, meaningful relationships, and skillful creative collaboration all grow out of what we can do in terms of harmony with others. And then harmony with nature. Caring, practical partnership. We know so much already about how to really have humanity live in a deep partnership with the biosphere, but we aren't doing it because we don't have harmony within and we don't have harmony with others. If we can clear those up, it becomes like a love affair with nature and a profound feeling of coming home. So imagine a world of such cultures. The end of war as an institution, the end of dominant systems of government, the end of dominance organizational forms, the end of poverty, the end of systematic traumatization in all its forms. And that includes the ways those show up in terms of things like racism and sexism and all the other isms. And in fact, an end to all of the various polycrisis issues. That's the opportunity that's in front of us. It may sound wildly utopian, but in fact, we're at the edge of that. And the momentum of cultural change is moving us in that direction. It's the opportunity for the emergence of a truly compassionate and creative humanity, a non-traumatized humanity, ushering in what I call the planetary era. We have the winds of cultural evolution at our backs, but we must raise our own sails in order to really tap into that. That's the opportunity as I see it. Okay, and it's, what can I say? I don't want to get off of that quite so soon because it's so much my heart song. It's so much what deeply motivates me as I feel hundreds of generations of ancestors standing behind me who wish that they were this close and whose efforts have gotten us this close. I feel their presence. Okay. Now to shift into looking more specifically at cognition, which is a huge territory. The definition that I'm using, the description I'm using, the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experiences, and the senses. Pretty huge, but pretty foundational as well. Being skillful with diverse modes of cognition is going to enable us to experience life more fully, communicate more effectively, think with more clarity and refinement, find better solutions, reduce and resolve conflicts, and through all this, accelerate the emergence of the planetary era. Okay, that's great, but how do we actually do it? Well, let's look first at how cognition begins, because it's in these beginnings that we find the patterns that continue and the patterns that we'll need to work with. The current studies of infant development have come up with a set of core knowledge systems that we seem to be, it's equipment we have as we arrive, let me put it that way. Objects. We're able to, infants are able to perceive and in some sense understand objects right from the very beginning. Agents. Infants have a sense of what it means to have a goal and what's efficient, what causes things. Persons. Infants have a sense of connection, vital connection with others, that where there's a sense of some kind of shared personhood experience. Place. Even though it's rudimentary, infants have a sense of orientation to direction and distance. Form, angle, relative length, and number. Very simple at the beginning, but still there. This is all from Elizabeth Spelke, who's a developmental psychologist at Harvard, been doing great stuff for decades. these core knowledge systems that we seem to come in with, there are innate as far as we can tell. They emerge early, but they stay. They're present. I mean, they're functioning in us now. They're present in other animals, and therefore they're ancient. They activate each one of these. The reason that they get distinguished is that they activate specific systems in the brain. And they're foundational for learning and cognition. And that's why I want to bring them in here, because they're so important in that way. But they're rudimentary when they arrive in infants. So infants have a sense of what an agent may be about, but they don't really have much of an idea about why they're doing what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. Their understanding of objects is quite simple. And with all of these, understanding of number, it's all very simple, but they've got the starting point. Now I want to look particularly now at object, because object winds up being really crucial in the way in which we develop our whole cognition systems. So from the infant's point of view, object is something that has cohesion, continuous with closed edges, solid, they can't interpenetrate, and the associations that they have are connected to it. And you may wonder, how do the developmental psychologists figure this out for infants? They've done one of the primary ways in which they do these experiments is that they track the eye motion of the infants. And through that, they can tell when are the infants surprised and when are they just, oh yeah, that's what I expect. And through that, they've been able to discern an incredible amount about what infants expect. Infants also expect objects to have continuity. They expect all the parts to move together. They expect it, when something moves, they expect it to move continuously, not, be here and then disappear and then reappear. And in that process, they seem to already ignore context and relationships so that they can segment out just the object. The ignoring of context and relationships has important bearing for what we're going to get into later. And then contact. Infants' concept of an object is that it's inanimate. And so the only way that it moves or is affected is when some other object contacts it. Not immediately, but soon, infants develop something called object permanence, which means that when something goes away and then reappears, they recognize it as the same object. When they're going through the stage of developing that object permanence, this is the time when peekaboo gets to be really fun with them and fun for them. Why is it so fun? Because infants are really good at recognizing faces, but when you hide your face, it goes away. At some stage, you do that and the infant will cry. Later, as they're starting to be, get the inside story, then it's a delight for them. But part of what this means is that they've learned to internalize a concept of the external thing, but they also wind up needing to treat that concept and thus the thing as if it was timeless. That's another issue that we're going to deal with as we move along. Okay, so what gets built on this core, and how does our knowledge systems build out from these very initial things that infants arrive with? One of the key things that happens is categorization. So you have some direct experience, and out of that direct experience, the mind builds a category, and there are structures in the brain that show up relative to these things. So we get the category red out of these various direct experiences of color. And then with another set of direct experiences, we get the category blue. But then there's yet another level, a generalized category of color. And it's yet a different kind of brain structure that holds onto that generalized level. categorization is incredibly valuable for us. It simplifies, it's very efficient. It simplifies our understanding of the world in very powerful ways. And it enables us to do categorical thinking, where you start with, you perceive an instance, say your category is dog, and you perceive something that you recognize as a dog, and you assign it to that category of dog. And then you have various patterns that you associate, expectations of behavior and other things of this sort that you associate with that category. And you apply those patterns to the instance. So you don't have to have knowledge about every instance. You can simply have knowledge about the categories and know which category to put instances in. It's incredibly efficient. And I want to say that reason is a specialized slow form of categorical thinking. However, categorical thinking doesn't work well when the individuality of the instance matters. The context of the instance matters. There are continuous variables in the instance that it's hard to categorize. A good example of this is color. I started off with categorizing colors, but when you're really working with color, naming them doesn't work. If you're doing any kind of computer-based color work, you know that you're working with continuous variables for hue and saturation and brightness in order to find any one of the millions of colors that potentially can be there. It also becomes problematic if you put something in the wrong category, which we wind up doing all the time, or when no single category is sufficient. And categorical thinking is particularly troublesome when we apply it to people, because people actually have a huge variety of categories that they could be put in. And which one should we put this person in? Well, there are better ways to handle it than categorical thinking, and we're getting to that. There's another way in which we build out, and that's using metaphor. And this is really important because it's not just a figure of speech. It's actually very central to the way in which we connect our embodied experience with more abstract ideas or internal things like emotional states or other ways in which we are able to communicate. So here you might think that, well, brilliant, isn't that just a descriptor, an adjective for people's minds? No, it comes originally from light sources. And it's the embodied experience of light sources that then we translate metaphorically into something about people's minds. Again, in a pattern, and I'm doing this so that it's really just the same thing, very similar here. You have the target concept, you recognize it, you link it to a source concept, you identify the patterns, and then you apply it to the target. So that's the way metaphorical thinking works. But again, you have some of the same issues that you have in categorical thinking about what source are you going to use. And it makes a difference, because if you use one source rather than another source, it colors the way that you approach something. And here, I won't go through all this, but there are just this 10 different source metaphors that could be connected, and there are probably more, to the abstract notion of ideas. So another way that things are built out is through language. And language contributes both words and grammar. And I want to distinguish between those two. So words, I think of as shareable labels. They're tags that you can put onto concepts and categories. Concepts and categories, by the way, are two sides of the same coin, basically. Concept describes the description of a set, and categories kind of describe the box of the set. One of the great things about words are that they're an open-ended stock, so that you can have more and more of them, you can add to them. They're not limited, but within a given language group of speakers, you have a common set of words that you can use. But they require shared definitions. Now, there are lots of words that have more than one definition to them, but we're able to do that because the context helps us figure out which definition we should use. But they still need to be relatively simple and shared in order for language to work. That's brilliant in some situations, becomes really problematic in others. And speaking of shared definitions, because the definition winds up being so crucial, we have a lot of battles, political battles and otherwise, over the definitions of words. Politically, there's a lot of, one of the words that the definition of freedom, for instance, is something that people struggle with each other over. But probably the worst in all this is the definition of God, where humans have been killing each other for thousands of years, arguing, fighting over the definition of God. Grammar. It enables structured connections so that we don't just have the label on the concept, but we're able to start stringing the concepts together in some kind of meaningful way. And through that, it enables the new concepts, novel concepts. However, the complexity of what we're able to produce in any one expression winds up being limited by the way in which in the language parts of our brain, we're limited to 4 chunks of working memory. And so there's only so much we can store and relate together as we put a sentence together, for instance. Now we can string long strings of sentences one after another, but that's different than what can happen in the moment. So language builds on all those core knowledge innate concepts. Nouns are mostly from objects. Verbs are mostly from the actions of agents, propositions from places, conjunctions from numbers. Not 100% this way, but that's really the starting point. I also want to make the point that language is the original technology for creating virtual reality. It creates shared imaginary worlds. And that's been an incredible gift. It's, what we do with storytelling. However, it also introduces the challenge that there's lots of opportunity for falsehood and deception in this virtual reality that we call language. All right. With that as a kind of a starting point, I want to now move on to what I see as the core Age of Enlightenment modernist dysfunctions relative to cognition. And the first one is the monopoly of object perception. And object perception is fabulous in its place. It does wonderful things for us, but it has its limitations. Designed by evolution for quick identification and simple categorical descriptions, it encourages stereotyping because of this. Breaks down for anything that violates those principles of cohesion, continuity, and contact. And in fact, in the real world, we have lots of those. And it's especially a poor fit for persons, abstract concepts, and systems, and internal experiences. And our culture struggles in dealing with all of these. So the monopoly of object perception winds up being one of the causes, I would say, of the polycrisis. The second dysfunction is the monopoly of language-based thinking. And again, there are limitations in language-based thinking. It's great for linear storytelling, but it's poor for complex systems. Complexity in it limited by the 4 chunks of working memory. Because it depends on simple shared definitions, there are many places in more complex arenas that it simply can't go. It's inherently categorical. Words are basically labels on categories. And we try to soften that somewhat by stringing, modifiers, adjectives, adverbs, etc., onto words, but then create kind of little Venn diagrams, if you will, of meaning. But it still winds up being quite categorical, and inherently so. And for complex domains and challenges, it's more likely to generate conflict than understanding. Have you noticed that in the political arena lately? So again, the polycrisis is that the monopoly of language-based thinking, I would claim, is one of the causes, one of the influential causes behind the polycrisis. Okay, so how do we break out of these monopolies? I would suggest we do it by using all of the capacity in our brain. We've been using a lot of the temporal lobe, which is both where language is and where object identification is. Fabulous capability, but not all we need. There's a lot more to the brain. Got the frontal lobe for executive functions. This is where the slow thinking really resides. But then motor cortex and sensory cortex for the body. Parietal lobe, which is all about spatial understandings, the where pathway. Occipital lobe for vision. And the cerebellum for motion. So we've got a lot more of the brain that we could be using. So let's start by breaking up the monopoly of object perception. And we're going to do this with something that I describe as territories and maps. Territories use place as their metaphor out of the core rather than object. And by doing that, they're an alternative to object as a basis for perception. And I'm not going to suggest that we use this totally instead of, I'm not suggesting we replace object. This is more something that we add to object perception. Even though territory has a kind of physical, metaphorical start to it, we can use it for non-physical things as well. Think of it as a domain or whatever. And territories are primarily identified by their boundaries. And you begin by assuming that you don't know all that you could know about what's inside. The territory is an invitation to explore. So let me make some contrasts here between objects and territories. So the core metaphor, objects are object and territories are place. The focus, in an object, it's on the thing as a unit. And with a territory, the focus is actually inside the boundary. Objects are useful for simple inanimate things, territories for people, systems, concepts. The thinking mode that goes best with objects is fast thinking. And the thinking mode for territories is best really with slow thinking, although you can do fast thinking with it too. You describe objects through categories and you describe territories through maps. And the thinking type that goes with objects is categorical thinking, and the thinking type that goes with territories is systems thinking. I hope that gives you a feel of the difference between those two. I also want to make the point that this distinction between objects and territory isn't out there. It's a human choice. We're wired in such a way that we will always initially see something as an object. But we can choose on a case-by-case basis as to when it's when it makes better sense to switch out of that object perception to territory perception. Maps are derivative. They're created by people, selective information about a territory to serve some purpose. And so that means that every map is partial. It only contains some of the information about what's in the territory. It's selective because somebody chose it. And it's provisional because there's always more to learn. All of our knowledge, fundamentally, if we understand it this way, is partial, selective, and provisional. And any single territory can have many valid maps serving diverse purposes. This is one of the great gifts of shifting to a territory's maps perspective. Unlike with categories which need a clear single definition, territories can have a whole stack of related maps. We don't have to fight over which map. Just because the Buddhists have a good map doesn't mean that the Sufi map is wrong. And seeing people as territories is core to ending racism, sexism, etc. We aren't going to end these things by coming up with somewhat better categories to put people into. Really. We need to get to the point where we realize that each person is an amazing territory in themselves and have that expectation as we approach anyone. When do you switch into the territory map kind of approach? Well, as I say, for people, systems, and abstract concepts, when the thing's uniqueness matters, or when the thing has parts, relationships, and context that are important, and any time that shared understanding about something is important and not obvious. Using territories and maps in groups is enormously helpful for the real communication that needs to happen often in groups. I also want to mention some more alternative metaphors that you can use to bring into language a more territory and map, a more spatial kind of approach. One is composites, where you need to understand what's in the thing, even if those are in chunks that you can label separately well enough. Layers, stacking up layers of maps, layers of all kinds of things. Sliders, being able to engage in continuous change rather than going boom from one category to another in a clear-cut division. I'm going to have something to share with you about that in just a moment. Spaces, where as many dimensions as you want, again with continuous variables. And fields, where fields interpenetrate with each other. Fields aren't just in one place. Fields are very different from the bounded object that the infant expects. And of course, systems as a generalization of all of that. So let me go back to this business of sliders for just a moment. I want to make a contrast between categorical boxes and something where there's more of a continuous variation. And I want to do that particularly with the idea of signal and noise. And so I'm going to switch to another page here. See if I can do this. Now, are you seeing this thing? Great. And now oh, phooey. Let me see if I can. Great. Okay. Can you hear this? At the moment, I'm all the way down at the signal end. Now I'm all the way down at the noise end. Here I'm in the middle, and I'll bet you can still pick out some of that signal. Here you can just sort of get the noise in the background. Here, if you're really paying attention, you can still get the signal. All right. Let me go back to here. Okay, did you see that? Did I switch windows? Did that work? Good, great. You can play with that at context.org/crossfade, by the way. And just to really take that in, because so much of life is not categorical boxes. So much of life involves sliders, where there's mixtures of things, where there's mixtures of signal and noise, or whatever it may be. All right, so what kind of takeaways can we have here? I really encourage you to be quick to distinguish between the simple, non-controversial situations in which object perception and categorical thinking work well. A lot of our everyday life fits into that. And their object perception and categorical thinking are brilliant in those situations. They're efficient, they're quick, they're all we need. But the issues that we're struggling with in the world today aren't like that. They're complex or controversial, and they need the extra effort. And it's worth it. Learn to distinguish between them and then be skillful at switching back and forth, which means you need to get sufficiently adept at using territories and maps so that it's something that you can just snap into. As soon as you recognize, oh God, we're arguing about definitions, that means that this is too complex for a simple definition. We're struggling over the way in which we don't know what category it should go into. Well, we probably shouldn't even be putting it in categories. We should just be mapping it. All of these things, just really be able to get sensitive to them. But then hold your maps lightly. Hold them with humility. Your map is partial and selective and provisional. Somebody else's map is also partial and selective and provisional. You don't have to decide which map is right. Learn from each other's maps and use them. Okay, now let's step to breaking the monopoly of language-based thinking. I'm going to start with visual spatial cognition. And let me just say, we're going to break out of language-based, the monopoly of language-based thinking by being able to use visual spatial thinking and kinesthetic somatic thinking. So visual spatial, unlike the linear form of language, is massively parallel, just like the subconscious is, just like the brain is. And through that, it can simultaneously access hugely more information than we can through language. In an image, you get it all at once, even though it may take a little while to sort of take it all in. Language is kind of like brailing over. You got to run your finger over the process in this linear way compared to visual and spatial imagery. And it directly includes relationships and context on an equal footing with the things that are there. So it breaks out of linearity, and you can have two or more dimensions. It doesn't impose a narrative. You can use symbol systems, but you don't have to. And what you share with visuals is much more direct than what has to pass through the abstraction of language. can still be misunderstood, but it's much more direct. And visual cognition can still make use of words, even if it's not using the grammar of language, it can still use words as a way to provide the tags for concepts. So in doing this, we're making use of both the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe, really good parts of our inner real estate. Take her in. She is a territory. How much more do you take in? Imagine trying to describe this picture and really get anywhere close to what you just experienced by looking at it. So how do we use this for cognition? Well, one of the simple ways is like Post-its or anything where you can break out, with Post-its, you're putting chunks of language. That's cool. But you're not organizing them initially, and you can organize them later, and you can move how the organization goes. There's no grammar that's trying to nudge you in the direction of any particular organization. So you're much freer, and you're dealing with it in a two-dimensional space. You could have other tools that let you deal with it in an n-dimensional space. You can also do diagrams. This is a diagram of a habit process. I see some people on the call here who been part of Bright Future Now, and you will certainly recognize this diagram. And diagrams like this allow us to get out of the 4 chunks of working memory, allow us to externalize what's going on, and allow us to get beyond linearity in order for us to better understand processes and better understand where we might be able to usefully intervene in processes. And then this, now you're going to probably go, hey, too much information. Yes, it is too much information all at once in an instant, but this is a diagram map of the London Underground. And what I love about this is that in this one map, you have thousands of different stories of connecting one station to another station. And it's all here. And you can use this map as the basis for so many different possibilities and see them in relationship with each other, see how they fit together. Okay, skillful takeaways. Anything that merits slow thinking merits spatial visual support. And I really encourage you, you may already have a good toolkit for that kind of spatial visual support, but still keep expanding it. Your capacity to diagram your whiteboards, your whatever, your drawing, your photography, whatever it is. There's a reason why the camera is such an important part of cell phones, because people are so hungry for the ability to communicate with others visually. But in the moment, use whatever tools support your creative flow. Don't be held back by the fact that, oh my God, I'd have to learn this thing in order to do that. And geez, I don't want to move up that learning curve. No, no, no. Do something really simple. It can be as simple as Post-its. It can actually be as simple as an outline. Outlines actually, especially if you're using an electronic outliner where you can shift stuff around, they actually, even though it looks like language, it is partly language, it introduces a visual spatial element to it. And I'm going to say something that's probably really politically incorrect, but even bullet points have a visual quality to them. All right, let's move on to kinesthetic, somatic cognition. This also involves a really close interaction with the subconscious and massively parallel processing. And it connects us to the deep roots of metaphorical sources, because our metaphorical sources tend to be body-related experiences. So even if we're trying to work on something that seems very abstract, being able to connect into the body is still a very fruitful way to go. It doesn't need any part of language, as you'll see in some of the examples that I'm about to give you. And it can communicate through, I like to call it neuron mirroring, mirror neurons, whatever. It's the capacity that we have when we see somebody else doing something. Actually, our brains mimic what the other person is doing. And it increases our attunement to the body. And it turns out that it increases overall cognitive agility. People who do more movement are more easily able to shift from one task to another, and other things of this sort. So it isn't only about the movement. Makes use of, again, major parts of the brain: motor cortex, sensory cortex, cerebellum. Okay, so, but what is kinesthetic thinking? We're not accustomed to recognizing it, but I want to show you an example that probably everyone on this call has done at some point. Every time you're driving, you are doing very sophisticated kinesthetic thinking, as you are piecing together what you were observing with your motions and the way in which you are instructing the vehicle through the steering wheel and the pedals and all of that stuff. And observing all the various different cars around you, and keeping track of all that in spatial terms. It's actually pretty sophisticated kinesthetic cognition. Even more so is something like this. Incredible amount of kinesthetic thinking, kinesthetic cognition going on in a game like this. And one of the reasons that we love to watch sports is because of that neuron mirroring. We may not have the acquired skills or other things that enable us to do that, but we can still, somehow or another, we experience it in our bodies and we like it. And speaking of neuron mirroring, miming works, and it works without language. So what are some of the things that you can do? Improv dance is a great way to kind of access what is it that your body wants to say? What is it that your body wants to do? You don't have to perform in a particular way, but let your body express itself, and express itself in relationship with others. Enter into conversations that are purely kinesthetic and somatic. Speaking of all that, there's a technique called body storming, which is, it's a derivative, if you will, from brainstorming, that's been used by molecular scientists to try to understand how molecules move around in cells and come up with various different hypotheses where the participants, the dancers, and other participants take role play into various different molecules with various different roles, and then move around in conjunction with each other. And it turns out to actually be quite insightful. And even if you don't do it in that kind of structured way, there's a long tradition that says when you're struggling with a problem, go for a walk. And then somatic awareness. How do we bring awareness into our bodies? How do we discover what's going on and not just being ahead, not just be a head floating above our bodies? This is, by the way, an illustration for the inner smile exercise, which happens to be the first day in Bright Future Now. Muscle testing. Now here I'm going to get out on a limb, and this is, I didn't mean that quite as the pun that it is, but I don't know whether you have ever experienced muscle testing with a skilled practitioner, but I certainly have. I have a very skilled, started off as a chiropractor, I'd really call him a healer at this point, who uses muscle testing very well. And what does that mean? It means that he will work on my body in some way and then have me resist his hand. And if his adjustment has gone well, I have real strength in my arm. If it hasn't, then he can easily just push my arm down. And it is amazing to go through the process, to have the experience of that if you haven't had it. The degree to which our capacity for resisting somebody else's push can change so radically and quickly. And I will acknowledge that I have been doing self-muscle testing now for probably about 25 years. And I want to start off right away and say, this has been very helpful, and it definitely has noise as well as signal. It definitely takes practice. It's one of those things that you can always force to have it come out the way you want it to, just like motivated reasoning. You can have motivated muscle testing just as well as motivated reasoning. But if you're willing to really listen to the body, it is remarkably helpful for body-related concerns. I found it very helpful in my own life for dealing with what is it appropriate for me to eat now in a very individualized, context-sensitive, time-sensitive basis. All right. Fast thinking always involves the body. And just like with the visual spatial, anything that merits slow thinking merits kinesthetic somatic support. Get up and move. And expand your toolkit. And as before, as you're working on expanding your toolkit, nevertheless, in the moment, use the tools you're comfortable with. So just a few more things. I want to touch on what I think of as a mode of cognition, thinking of intuition, if you will, as a mode of cognition. And recognize, first of all, that most of what we think arises out of the subconscious. The Age of Enlightenment had this sort of purist, stuffy idea that as rational thinkers, that we were all clearly up in our rational conscious minds, and that's where thought actually happened. Well, most thought actually gets generated in the subconscious, even for that kind of rational exercise. And I like to think of novel thoughts as everyday intuitions. Where'd they come from? I haven't had that thought before. How did it emerge? Our defenses introduce a lot of noise into the whole thinking process, and that includes into those, what I'm calling everyday intuitions. Gut feelings sometimes have some really useful information in them, and sometimes they're just a reflection of the fears associated with your defense patterns. So we need to do optimal zone living in order to improve the quality of our thinking generally. And for those of you who like to consider that intuition sometimes comes from a wider consciousness field than just your own brain, I would also suggest to you that optimal zone living supports a clearer signal in that case as well. And the really radical thing that I want to say is that quieting your defenses may be at least as important as quieting your mind. In fact, quieting your mind may be a kind of a symptom level exercise, where quieting your defenses also winds up quieting your mind in the appropriate ways in a more foundational sense. All right. One more thing here. Knowledge systems. Western science. Brilliant stuff. It seeks reliable properties of categories. Aims for timeless, context-free truth. And it works really well in the objects, categories, and categorical thinking paradigm. But it's a little too reductionist. And so it struggles with people, it struggles with systems, wherever there's complexity. So what do we add to that? I'm not saying throw out Western science. Where it's good, it's brilliant. But I suggest what we need to be able to add to that is pattern languages. And in fact, there are a whole lot of pattern languages that have been developed in non-Western cultures. I would, for instance, cite Chinese medicine as an example of a pattern, of more of a pattern language approach. And what's involved in that? Phooey. Excuse me. This isn't quite the same as the kind of experiments that are done in Western science, but what you do with a pattern language is that you look for patterns among similar instances, but you allow a little more fuzziness in terms of what qualifies as an instance and what qualifies as a pattern, but you still look for what you could almost think of as statistical patterns. And that's one of the reasons that in the social sciences, where you're dealing with all that complexity of humans and culture, they aren't able to come up with strict categorical rules. To the extent they come up with anything, it's coming up with statistical patterns. And then you're able to apply those patterns as custom constellations into whatever the individual situation is, whether it's an individual person's health, or with the architectural pattern language, it's the development of a building or a neighborhood or a city or other things of that sort, all of which are again, very complex. And pattern languages, I would say, work well in the territories, maps, systems thinking paradigm. We need both of them. We need a lot more work on really developing the methods, the traditions, the capacity in our contemporary times to really do pattern language thinking. So, takeaways. Territories and maps break the monopoly of object perception. Use them, please use them. Visual, spatial, and kinesthetic somatic thinking break the monopoly of language-based thinking. Please use them. Breaking these monopolies is core to the emergence of the planetary era. We need to be able to have a different level of thinking if we're really going to move forward. And it's right there. It's not like we need some really complicated thing. Our visual capabilities and our kinesthetic capabilities are already there. We just have to use them. Okay, thank you for this segment. And now I want to just say, coming up is next week, Adept at New Strategies for Success. And I'm going to be drawing on both the previous two as we kind of weave them together into really how to move forward into what I would call a win-win-win, a 3 wins world in which you win, the other wins, and the surround wins, the context wins. And then on December 7th, we're going to have an open time. I won't be doing any presentation. It'll just be an open time for a lot more conversation. And if you want to go deeper, the next Bright Future Now is coming right up. And I especially want to point out that early bird registration ends at the end of this week, Saturday. So if you're interested and you would like to do the early bird registration, now is the time to do it. Just go to context.org and you'll find the information that you need. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. So at this point, I would invite those who have questions to share their questions in the chat. I'll remind you that if you would like to not be a part of the recording, you can indicate in the chat that you would like me to read your question on your behalf. I can kick us off a little bit with kind of going, I can deeply feel kind of the genuine deep invitation to say, please use them on the different kind of modes of cognition there. And I want to kind of acknowledge and appreciate the design challenge of putting together a Zoom presentation while doing your best to incorporate as many diverse modes of cognition in the presentation itself, such that between the audience and the presenter, there can be a genuine stepping into that kind of practice. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about the design of that, because to say that I even selfishly, that's really relevant for me personally. And perhaps that might be an invitation in terms of how you might think about it specifically in the Bright Future Now network, but also more generally in terms of how you think about the patterns of design into supporting the practices of different kinds of modes of cognition. I'd love to hear some about that.
Boy, I feel like I'm still learning. I constantly catch myself doing patterns that I learned a long time ago that don't adequately incorporate this. So that heartfelt call to use them is said to me as well as to everybody else, is what I would say. But I will also say that one of the reasons why I feel more comfortable in this setting, being able to do a presentation rather than just speaking, I don't think I could have communicated. Certainly not as well, what was in the presentation if I had only been speaking, because there's so many places where the visuals really help. Now, we didn't get a chance to do a lot of kinesthetic stuff, but at least there was the visuals. And in what we do in Bright Future Now, where it's not just the modes of cognition, but it's also the relational stuff. It's very intentional the way we have set things up so that each person who is in the process of going through this, what we call this adventure tour to the future, has an ally, a one-on-one graduate who's been through it before. So they have a one-on-one connection with them. And then they're in triads. So they get to interact with others at that level. And then we have these weekend meetings where they're typically 8 or so people in the meeting. And so you're constantly involved in relational activities at the same time that you're dealing with cognitive stuff, at the same time you're working on your experiential things, so that it weaves the whole brain experience in, and more than a whole brain, I want to say a whole being, because it's body and who knows what else in terms of consciousness. I mean, I don't, what can I say? Never mind. And as I put something like this presentation together, I do start off actually with a flexible outline and kind of move things around and then get some stuff in. And as I do, I iterate over it. And as I iterate over it, I find places where I go, oh, that needs more visuals there. Or is there something I could do to break it up? Or is there, so I keep asking myself that level of question at the same time. Does that get at all to, I mean, it's just, as much as anything, it's just me trying to be aware.
Totally. And it sounds to me like part of how you explicitly design the structure of Bright Future Now, plus it essentially comes to deeply incorporating the context to support the individual's capacity to practice these very skills that are so important. Right. And how you mentioned the kind of having alumni being paired up in a way that kind of naturally brings in a sort of intergenerational like nature to how we learn. Mm-hmm. And to that effect, I'd love to then kind of expand a little on the intergenerational front and ask kind of from your perspective, there are these are deeply how could I put it, like longitudinal practices, over on the individual level, over decades, over lifetimes, and mm-hmm. over in terms of the species level, as you had talked about in terms of the transition from empire to planetary, this is on the level of centuries and millennia. And mm-hmm. so I'm curious from your perspective, how have you seen sort of these modes of cognition evolve over time in terms of getting traction in the general population, or neglect, or yeah.
Well, the first thing that pops to my mind is that the last couple of decades have seen, I think, a really significant cultural level shift in terms of the use of visual cognition. So and that's in no small part to what we can do with our screen-based technologies. So we haven't had as much of a shift in the kinesthetic realm, probably because there hasn't been that sort of support. But it really is shifting now, and that's a way in which the winds of cultural evolution are at our backs. We just for the visual stuff, we just need to keep using it better and better. And then add in the kinesthetic pieces as well. And certainly do as well as we can with language. I mean, language is incredibly valuable, fabulous human invention. I don't mean to totally diss it. I just mean to say its monopoly is the problem. Language isn't the problem. The monopoly is the problem. Object perception is not the problem. The monopoly of object perception is the problem.
Then and I'll then kind of touch on how you're sort of clarifying the phrasing in saying how it's not language itself that's the issue, but contextualizing it to become a set of skill sets that we can develop fluency in. I'm curious to kind of examine a little bit your personal experience, recalling earlier the kind of the genuine invitation to say, please use them, as well as the way that I experience you when you kind of make dramatic pauses after a number of different kind of statements for, I'm sure, very intentional purposes. How have you found your experience over the last decades of doing the work that you're doing in trying to convey some of these ideas that are clearly so important to you? What is it like to go through decades of trying to convey, I wouldn't call them the same message, but certainly right. The common pattern, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So frustrating, but it's also one of the things I want to put in here is that when I do something like that pause, I would describe that as something that I do intuitively. It's not something, it's not like I'm planning out all this stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that I think is really quite cool in the design of Bright Future Now, but I didn't sit down beforehand and design it that way. I just made choices that made sense to me along the way. So there's a lot of intuition that enters into it. But I would also say that I am feeling now like I am better able to communicate because there is more openness to hear things that I have been working on for decades. And that really energizes me too. You know, I'm delighted. For me, the three eras of tribal and empire and planetary provide a context, a historical context. The three harmonies within, with others, with nature provide a direction, a desired, you know, way to go, something that we can use to characterize a desirable future. And the things that we're working on in this set, the savvy about psychodynamics and skillful with diverse modes of cognition and adept at the new strategy for success, for those for me provide the means for us to be able to get to really embodying the three harmonies. And so it's been a long time since I've been able to say that in, what was that, less than a minute? You know, less than two, certainly. And have people smile and nod their heads and, you know, like they're sort of understanding what I'm saying. And that's really exciting, because then we're at a point where we've got something that we can run with. And really, because now the challenge is the practice. The challenge is, how do we actualize this? How do we embody it? How do we manifest it? And that has gazillion specifics to it.
Awesome. Cool. I would love to invite Stephanie to ask your question then.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I'm just finishing up the fall cohort with the Bright Future Network, and I'm a big fan. I feel like I've been transformed as a person. And I have Robert on call all the time, and I don't need to do this here, but I thought I would share it because it came up for me in your talk today. So you were talking about kinesthetic, somatic, experiential use of the brain. And I have a question regarding like online interaction versus in-person interaction. I have a sense that it's still kinesthetic. Watching someone give a presentation using visuals and voice online. And I do feel that I feel the effects of that. And I'm just wondering if you've done any mapping of that. And
Yeah.
did you have originally in-person events more than you're doing online ones over the years? So
Well,
that's my question.
Okay, so yeah, the neuron mirroring works on Zoom. You know, so we can, I mean, it's one of the reasons you can watch a sports event on TV and feel like you're there. So I think there is that connection. I also have the sense that when people are willing to connect to each other, there's a connection in consciousness that happens regardless of distance. I can't say that I've really done any mapping of it. I've had lots of experience in the past with face-to-face stuff, but when we started to do Bright Future Now and the Bright Future Network, I was very committed to having it be worldwide. and there was no way to have it worldwide, and then say, okay, and we're going to figure out how we're going to do all these plane fares for people from South Africa, and it's not in my budget. So I think there is a magic that can happen in the in-person space, and what comes up for me is some of the improvisational dance that I've done and some of the mirroring exercises. You stand next to a person and you both hold up your hands, and they're not touching, but they're close, and you move around in that way. I think that's a little harder to do. Who knows, we might be able to do it, but a little harder to do here. I just think we need to use all the tools that are available to us. And I look forward to a time when I will be able to do more in-person stuff. But I doubt very much that I will abandon this, because it enables us to be so efficiently non-geographic.
Thank you.
And good to see you, Stephanie.
Cool. Ryan has a question in relation to optimal zone and how that may line up with the Buddhist model. Ryan, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Robert, I'd like to ask it in two parts, if that's okay. Could I do the first part? Right. So the first one is just, as far as the optimal zone, I watched your first talk with the Stoa, and I haven't seen one prior to this one. Mm-hmm. So if I apologize. But it seems that there's a lot of indication of the optimal zone being the place to operate from, mm-hmm. and track how we might get into it. I imagine there's not a single answer for everybody, but I would also imagine that the answers might have like some similarities or some overall pattern or something. So my first curiosity is just how would we get into it, and especially if we were able to get into it again and again and again, how might we make that like a permanent state, if that's possible?
Yeah. So let me just say that I think that there is an enormous amount of learning in the world's various spiritual traditions about this, because it's the same underlying territory, and we just have different maps for it, different languages, etc. That said, for me, one of the gifts of where we are today is that I find it really useful to look at it in terms of what's going on in the autonomic nervous system and how to kind of directly communicate with the autonomic nervous system. And so that's why one of the things you didn't see in the one that I did 2 weeks ago. I'm understanding you saw the first one, but not the one that I did 2 weeks ago. Yeah. So I shared an exercise there, which is, I'm happy to quickly share it again, but it involves, what you want to be able to do is to stimulate the upper parasympathetic nervous system, which is specifically in mammals and has to do with social connection, and is really good at being able to settle the more fight-flight parts of us. And so we can do that with things that are above our diaphragm, basically. And so combinations of being able to do a simple self-hug, where you cross your hands and you put it somewhere comfortable on your chest, and just feel that, it connects you right back to very early infant experiences. And then doing some simple breathing, as well as wiggling up your face so that you stimulate the muscles up here, which also stimulate the right nerves. So they're just some things that you can do of that sort. Now, you get into Buddhist practices or other kinds of practices, there's a lot that winds up being done for that. In the way that I approach the optimal zone, however, one of the distinctions I want to make is that it's not about trying to get away from this life. It's about being able to be fully incarnate in this life in a way in which what you're trying to do is to spend less time in your defenses. Not setting yourself up with the expectation that you will spend 0 time in your defenses, but that you can recover quickly and move back. So that help on the first part?
It absolutely does, yeah. And I do remember you showing that exercise in the first talk on the Stoa. It struck me at the time because it was pretty much what I was wondering. Yeah, and so I guess the easiest way to phrase this is, it seems like the idea is to be able to do exercises of that nature, whatever works for an individual,
right,
repeatedly, and like you were saying, just be able to notice and get out of defensiveness quicker.
right.
Buddhism is the map I'm most familiar with. Multiple spiritual traditions, multiple things, and I think you did a nice job of pointing out the tendency in a lot of Buddhist schools to kind of be not necessarily dissociative, but at least to remove from life, both getting more able to engage with it, but dodging that controversy a little bit. I'll just say that my understanding of the aim with the kind of Theravadan 4-path thing that some Buddhists do is the idea of being able to do an exercise like you're talking about enough that it becomes clear that it's worthwhile to do pretty much all the time. And then internalizing that progressively over 4 stages, such that it's almost like a person is able to be aware of when their defenses are coming up and let go of them so quickly that it's like pre-conscious, that it happens so fast all the time that it's supposedly the person never drops out of the optimal zone in a way that would be perceptible. I don't know if that even makes sense given your models, but I'm curious if it matches up.
Yeah, it does. And it's, I think for me, this may very well be in the practices that you're describing. For me, it's valuable to both have the immediate first aid of having the skills that, oh God, I'm triggered. How do I settle myself down and be able to work on unwinding, untangling the underlying belief systems and embodied, the body keeps the score kind of, the accumulated traumas. So that if you can work on both of those fronts, then it all becomes easier. And I'm, my pragmatism in this is that you could say that my real goal here is to have more people who are doing things that are accelerating the emergence of the planetary era. So I don't care if they're perfect in it. I just want them to be able to spend more time in a more competent state, which is what the optimal zone provides, and then get on with it.
Yeah, that's I'm biased, but I have the same inclination as you're talking about. Right. It's like I'm big on just if you can do the thing repeatedly and regularly, that's wonderful. It doesn't matter if you can optimize it, but at the same time, if it is something that can be made permanent, that seems really interesting and really worthwhile as well. And again, I'm going to dodge a whole controversy with thousands of years of Buddhists arguing with each other, but I really appreciate the clarification, because this is extremely valuable, and it's something that I've been wondering a lot about general optimal zone stuff, and particularly your model and terminology. So I really thank you so much for the answer. That was extremely helpful.
Great. Well, my intent with a lot of this is to have some stuff that's simple enough that it can mesh easily with, you prefer Buddhism, cool. You prefer Catholicism, cool. You prefer Sufism, cool. You know, just get in your optimal zone and then we'll talk.
Thank you so much.
Can I assume again that, Robert, you do not have a hard cut for in 2 minutes time?
Right.
Cool. In which case, I'd love to invite Rosa. I imagine the response earlier has already skirted around what you're thinking about. And if you would like there to be more elaboration, I would very much invite that.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think the question is still a relevant one because the previous question was more about individual optimal zone, and I'm very interested in interpersonal optimal zone. So, Robert, hi.
Hi.
I'm also in the Bright Futures Now course that is wrapping up right now, and it's been a wonderful experience. I am particularly interested. I love the distinction you're making about how categorical thinking has its limitations. And I just wanted to invite you to talk about something that I've not really asked you about so specifically before, but I'm really, one of my passions is relational epistemology and how do we move beyond, the argument as battle that is so prevalent in our culture.
Right.
I think brings out defensiveness and tends to move them out of the optimal zone and tends to end up in dualistic thinking. And so I'm really curious for you to speak a little bit about how mapping territories can help us move beyond the fight flight of polarized thinking.
Yeah, good. And by the way, this is something I'll be going into more next week. So you're, as usual, you're a little ahead of the curve. But let me say that one of the big things that humans want a lot is to be heard. And so if we put in the step of being able to surface people's maps, and receive that map, and you as a group facilitator will have seen this all the time. Just give people a chance to and write it on the flip chart, and people get acknowledged for what they're thinking. So in that same way, to the extent that in a conversation, we want to be able to shift arguments away from being power struggles about which of the options that arrived is going to be the winning option. Instead, we want to shift into design thinking, which says that the options that arrived at the beginning are simply starting points. And we want to be able to gather what we can and out of our design thinking come up with something better than anybody thought of when they arrived at the beginning. So the mapping is an important step, I feel, in the process of being able to draw that out. It's a slower process in the moment, but as so often happens with these things, the slower process winds up in the long run getting you faster, real results when you're willing to invest more upfront. So Rosa, I don't know whether that quite speaks to your image is frozen.
Yes. Whoops. Yeah, thank you. That is very helpful. And in fact, I've started describing what I do as more as mapping the territory than anything else. And I love the term that Tanya put in the chat of co-design thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yep, indeed.
Cool. Well, I'm feeling very much like the response to the poly crisis would be on the same order of generator that the poly crisis is on. That is to say, I don't know, maybe like a poly solution or something. And I feel like this these conversations have been very much pointing towards that, and it would seem that in the coming sessions there will be more expansion on additional aspects of how we want to holistically relate to the poly crisis, and how do we then have the embodied practices to actually enable or actualize it into the world that includes us. And so with that, I think I'll move towards a close. Are there any last words you'd like to share, Robert?
Just thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for these sessions have given me an opportunity to pull together some things that I wanted to pull together. And so I appreciate your tolerating my going through that. So thank you for showing up and being here.
And so with that, I think our usual close would be, Robert very much has additional work that you can check out, which is actually a whole multiple decades of treasure trove that you can check out on context.org. You can also, as he mentioned, join the Bright Future Now network, which is, I think registration is closing at this weekend, if I remember that correctly. And if you go to the stoa.ca, there will be more events coming up. And for anything else, we will be seeing you in a week's time for the third session of Robert's.
Great. I'll just detail the early bird registration closes on Saturday. Registration as a whole doesn't close until the 19th of December.
Great.
So there's still a possibility, but things are actually moving along pretty quickly, and we may fill. So I would suggest, if you're thinking of it, don't wait too long.
Cool. Then I will outro us and allow us to phase out.